you're expecting another soul sample tutorial, then I got bad news for you because I'm moving on from the 70s. Or at least I am for now. Now don't get me wrong, I love making 70s soul samples, but I do have a lot more up my sleeve. So today, I'm jumping ahead a decade, and I'm gonna show you how to make an authentic sounding 80s sample. So full disclosure, when I was making the sample, I was really trying to think along the lines of what kind of music from the 80s would sound good in songs today, or what artists today are using sounds from the 80s. And two of the main artists that came to my mind were Bruno Mars and The Weeknd. So that was kind of along the lines of what I was thinking when I made this. So for this sample, I actually started off with the bass. Now, to get this bass sound, I actually layered two synths together, which is a technique that certain producers in the 80s used to use in order to get their sounds to be more unique and more lush. Prince was actually famous for doing this with his sounds, which is one of the ways that he got his music to sound so unique. He would take multiple synthesizers and layer them together perfectly while using different filtering techniques and effects. So when other producers would try to figure out exactly what he was doing, they'd be stumped because they couldn't figure out what sounds he was using. Some of the synths and basses on Michael Jackson's Thriller album were created this way as well. So the first synth that I used here in order to try to emulate that technique was the ARP-2600V from Arturia, which is an emulation of the ARP-2600. And this is where I'm getting like the beef of the bass from. For the next bass, I went with another Arturia plugin, which is the Matrix 12V. And this is an emulation of the Oberheim Matrix 12. And as you can hear, that kind of has more of a brassy mid-range sound to it. And then another thing that I'm doing on the bass here is I'm using some automation. So you can hear it gives the bass a lot more flavor and makes it sound more interesting. Once I had the bass down, I decided to add some chords. So that sound is actually coming from a contact library that's been one of my best kept secrets for a really long time now, but I guess the cat's out of the bag. And that's the JD850, which is an emulation of a Roland keyboard called the JD800. Now for all my producers out there who are watching this and you know your synths, you probably know that the JD800 was released in 1991, but some of the design philosophy that went into creating the JD800 was a very 80s way of thinking still. And because of that, some of the sounds that are in the JD800 do still sound very 80s. Now as for effects, I didn't really do all that much. I just added some light EQ, and then I'm also running it through a bus that has the UAD Brigade chorus on it. I also used the mod wheel on my keyboard to add this vibrato effect, because without it, here's what the chords would sound like. Now, the last thing that I did for this section, which is kind of the A section of the sample, was I added a melody to play against the chords. And I used two sounds for that. The first sound was this bell sound. And believe it or not, for that, I just went with the basic 80s bell sound from Nexus. The second sound I went with is this kind of high-pitched plucked string. And for that sound, I went with the DX7V from Arturia, which is an emulation of the classic DX7 keyboard. For the B section, I dialed things back a lot. So instead of using the same synth that I used for the chords in the A section, I went with this flute pad, which is another sound that I found in the DX7. And as far as the effects on this, I'm basically treating it the same way that I treated the other chords. I'm using some EQ, and then I'm also running it through the same Brigade chorus that I was using before. And then I added a new bass line in order to match the chords in this section. So now I'm onto the C section of the sample, and the way that I started thinking about it once I got here was I really wanted to treat it like I was building out an actual song. So if I were to send this over to another producer so that they could use it and make a song out of it, the A section in my mind is kind of like the hook, the B section is kind of like the beginning of the first verse, and then the C section is kind of like the pre-hook leading into the hook. So here I went back to the JD 850 and tried to build out some chords that sounded like they could be leading from the verse into the hook. And then for the bass, it was pretty much the same thought process. And then to kind of add some icing or some sprinkles on top of the chords at the end of the C section, I brought back the bells and the DX7 strings. Now, if I were to send this out to another producer as a sample or as a starter, I'd probably leave everything as is. But the more I was listening to this, the more I decided that I wanted to hear some 80s drums on it. I pulled up Addicted Drums 2. I added a kick from the Lin drum, a snare from the Simmons SDS, an open hi-hat from the DMX, and then also some tambourines from the DMX. And so finally, once you put everything together, here's what it sounds like. So I really think the combination of those layered synths, the automation for movement, and the synthy bass lines really work together to give it that retro vibe. But hit me up in the comments and let me know what you think. Now, honestly, I've been having a lot of fun working on these retro vibes, but if you're more into that classic soul sound and you want to learn how to make your own 70s soul samples, check out this video right here.